Truth and Method by Hans-Georg Gadamer. Chapter 3. Historical Preparation. The questionableness of Romantic hermeneutics and its application to the study of history. The change in hermeneutics from the Enlightenment to Romanticism. If we are to follow Hegel rather than Schleiermacher, the history of hermeneutics must place its emphases quite differently. Its culmination will no longer consist in historical understanding, being liberated from all dogmatic bias. And we will no longer be able to view the rise of hermeneutics as Dilthey, following Schleiermacher, presented it. Rather, we must retrace Dilthey's steps and look out for goals other than those of Dilthey's historical self-consciousness. We will entirely disregard the dogmatic interest in the hermeneutical problem that the Old Testament already presented to the early Church, and will be content to pursue the development of the hermeneutical method in the modern period, which culminates in the rise of historical consciousness. The prehistory of Romantic hermeneutics. The art or technique of understanding and interpretation developed from analogous impulses along two paths, theological and philological. Theological hermeneutics, as Dilthey showed, developed from the Reformers' defense of their own understanding of Scripture against the attack of the Tridentine theologians and their appeal to the indispensability of tradition. Philological hermeneutics developed as instrumental to the humanist claim to revive classical literature. Both involve a rediscovery of something that was not absolutely unknown, but whose meaning had become alien and inaccessible. Classical literature, though constantly present as material for humanistic education, had been completely absorbed within the Christian world. Similarly, the Bible was the Church's sacred book, and as such was constantly read, but the understanding of it was determined and, as the Reformers insisted, obscured by the dogmatic tradition of the Church. Both traditions are dealing with a foreign language and not with the scholar's universal language of the Latin Middle Ages, so studying the tradition in the original made it necessary to learn Greek and Hebrew, as well as to purify Latin. By applying specialized techniques, hermeneutics claimed to reveal the original meaning of the texts in both traditions, humanistic literature and the Bible. It is of decisive importance that through Luther and Melanchthon, the humanistic tradition was united with the Reform. Insofar as scriptural hermeneutics is regarded as the prehistory of the hermeneutics of the modern human sciences, it is based on the scriptural principle of the Reformation. Luther's position is more or less the following. Scripture is sui ipsius interpres. We do not need tradition to achieve the proper understanding of Scripture, nor do we need an art of interpretation in the style of the ancient doctrine of the fourfold meaning of Scripture, but the Scripture has a univocal sense that can be derived from the text, the sensus literalis. The allegorical method in particular, which had formerly seemed indispensable for the dogmatic unity of scriptural doctrine, is now legitimate only where the allegorical intention is given in Scripture itself. Thus, it is appropriate when dealing with the parables. The Old Testament, however, should not acquire its specifically Christian relevance through an allegorical interpretation. We must take it literally, and precisely by its being understood literally and seen as the expression of the law superseded by the grace of Christ, the Old Testament acquires a Christian significance. The literal meaning of Scripture, however, is not univocally intelligible in every place and at every moment. For the whole of Scripture guides the understanding of individual passages, and again this whole can be reached only through the cumulative understanding of individual passages. This circular relationship between the whole and the parts is not new. It was already known to classical rhetoric, which compares perfect speech with the organic body, with the relationship between head and limbs. Luther and his successors transferred this image, familiar from classical rhetoric, to the process of understanding. And they developed the universal principle of textual interpretation, that all the details of a text were to be understood from the contextus and from the scopus, the unified sense at which the whole aims. Insofar as Reformation theology relies on this principle in interpreting Scripture, it remains bound to a postulate that is itself based on a dogma, namely that the Bible is itself a unity. Judged from the 18th century's historical point of view, Reformed theology is also dogmatic and excludes any sound individual interpretation of Scripture that takes account of the relative context of a text, its specific purpose, and its composition. Indeed, Reformed theology does not even seem to be consistent. By ultimately asserting the Protestant cradle formulae as guides to the understanding of the unity of the Bible, it too supersedes the scriptural principle in favor of a rather brief Reformation tradition. This was the judgment not only of counter-Reformation theology but of Dilthey. He glosses these contradictions in Protestant Hermeneutics from the viewpoint of the full self-awareness of the historical sciences. We in turn will have to inquire whether this self-consciousness, precisely in regard to the theological meaning of scriptural exegesis, is really justified, or whether the literary and hermeneutical principle of understanding texts in their own terms is not itself unsatisfactory and always in need of support from a generally unacknowledged dogmatic guideline. We can ask this question today, however, after historical enlightenment has reached the full extent of its possibilities. Dilthey's studies on the origin of hermeneutics manifest a convincing logical coherence, given the modern concept of science. Hermeneutics had to rid itself one day of all its dogmatic limitations and become free to be itself, so that it could rise to the significance of a universal historical organon. This took place in the 18th century, when men like Semler and Ernesti realized that to understand Scripture properly, it was necessary to recognize that it had various authors, i.e., to abandon the idea of the dogmatic unity of the canon. With this liberation of interpretation from dogma, Dilthey, the collection of the sacred Christian writings came to be seen as a collection of historical sources that, as written works, had to be subjected not only to grammatical, but also to historical interpretation. Understanding them in terms of their total context now necessarily also required the historical restitution of the living context to which the documents belong. The old interpretive principle of understanding the part in terms of the whole was no longer bound and limited to the dogmatic unity of the canon. It was concerned with the totality of the historical reality to which each individual historical document belonged. And since there is no longer any difference between interpreting sacred or secular writings, and since there is therefore only one hermeneutics, this hermeneutics has ultimately not only the propedeutic function of all historical research, as the art of the correct interpretation of literary sources, but involves the whole business of historical research itself. For what is true of the written sources, that every sentence in them can be understood only on the basis of its context, is also true of their content. Its meaning is not fixed. The context of world history, in which appears the true meaning of the individual objects, large or small, of historical research, is itself a whole, in terms of which the meaning of every particular is to be fully understood, and which in turn can be fully understood only in terms of these particulars. World history is, as it were, the great dark book, the collected work of the human spirit, written in the languages of the past, whose texts it is our task to understand. Historical research conceives itself on the model of philology. We will see that this is in fact the model on which Dilthey founded the historical view of the world. In Dilthey's eyes, then, hermeneutics comes into its own only when it ceases serving a dogmatic purpose, which, for the Christian theologian, is the right proclamation of the gospel, and begins functioning as a historical organon. If, however, the ideal of the historical enlightenment that Dilthey pursued should prove to be an illusion, then the prehistory of hermeneutics that he outlined will also acquire a quite different significance. Its evolution to historical consciousness would not then be its liberation from the chains of dogma, but a transformation of its nature. Precisely the same thing is true of philological hermeneutics. For the ars critica of philology unreflectively presupposed the exemplariness of classical antiquity, which it helped to hand down. It, too, had to change its nature when there was no longer any clear relation of model to copy between classical antiquity and the present. That this is the case is shown by the querelle des anciens et des modernes, which sounds the general theme for the whole period from French classicism to the German classical period. This problem resulted in the development of historical reflection, which finally demolished classical antiquity's claim to be normative. In the case of both literary criticism and theology, then, the same process led ultimately to the conception of a universal hermeneutics, for which the special exemplariness of tradition is no longer a presupposition of the hermeneutical task. Thus, the science of hermeneutics, as developed by Schleiermacher in his debate with the philologists F. A. Wolff and F. Ast, and further elaborated in Ernesti's theological hermeneutics, is not, then, just one more stage in the history of the art of understanding. Actually, the history of understanding has been accompanied, since the days of classical philology, by theoretical reflection. But these reflections have the character of a technique, i.e., they try to serve the art of understanding, just as rhetoric tries to serve the art of speaking, and poetics, the art and appreciation of poetry. In this sense, both the theological hermeneutics of the Fathers and that of the Reformation were techniques. But now, understanding as such becomes a problem. The universality of this problem shows that understanding has become a task in a new sense, and hence theoretical reflection acquires a new significance. It is no longer a set of techniques guiding the practice of philologist or theologian. Schleiermacher, it is true, calls his hermeneutics a technique, but in a quite different systematic sense. He seeks the theoretical foundation of the procedure, common to theologians and philologists, by reaching back beyond the concerns of each to the more fundamental relation, the understanding of thoughts. It was different for the philologists who were his immediate predecessors. For them, hermeneutics was determined by the content of what was to be understood, and this was the self-evident unity of classical and Christian literature. Ast's goal for all hermeneutics, to demonstrate the unity of Greek and Christian life, expresses what, basically, all Christian humanists think. Schleiermacher, on the other hand, no longer seeks the unity of hermeneutics in the unity of the content of tradition, to which understanding is applied, but rather he seeks it, apart from any particular content, in the unity of a procedure that is not differentiated even by the way the ideas are transmitted, whether in writing or orally, in a foreign language or in one's own. The effort to understand is needed wherever there is no immediate understanding, i.e., whenever the possibility of misunderstanding has to be reckoned with. Schleiermacher's idea of a universal hermeneutic starts from this, that the experience of the alien and the possibility of misunderstanding is universal. It is true that this alienation is greater and misunderstanding easier in artistic than in non-artistic utterance. And it is greater with written than with oral utterance, which is, as it were, continuously interpreted by the living voice. But precisely Schleiermacher's extending the hermeneutical task to meaningful dialogue, which is especially characteristic of him, shows how fundamentally the meaning of alienation, which hermeneutics is supposed to overcome, has changed in comparison to the task of hermeneutics as hitherto conceived. In a new and universal sense, alienation is inextricably given with the individuality of the thou. However, we should not take the lively, even brilliant sense of human individuality that characterizes Schleiermacher as an individual idiosyncrasy influencing his theory. Rather, through critique, he rejected everything that, under the rubric of rational ideas, vernünftige Gedanken, the Enlightenment regarded as the common nature of humanity, and this rejection necessitated completely redefining our relation to tradition. The art of understanding came under fundamental theoretical examination and universal cultivation, because neither scripturally nor rationally founded agreement could any longer constitute the dogmatic guideline of textual understanding. Thus, it was necessary for Schleiermacher to provide a fundamental motivation for hermeneutical reflection, and so place the problem of hermeneutics within a hitherto unknown horizon. To provide the right background for the genuine change that Schleiermacher makes in the history of hermeneutics, let us consider a point which Schleiermacher himself does not, and which, since Schleiermacher, has totally disappeared from the sphere of hermeneutics. Its absence curiously narrows Dilthey's historical interest in the history of hermeneutics. Nevertheless, it in fact dominates the problem of hermeneutics, and must be taken into account if we are to understand Schleiermacher's place in its history. We begin with this proposition. To understand means to come to an understanding with each other. Sich miteinander verstehen. Understanding is primarily agreement. Verständnis ist zunächst Einverständnis. Thus, people usually understand each other immediately, or they make themselves understood with a view toward reaching agreement. Einverständnis. Coming to an understanding, Verständigung, then, is always coming to an understanding about something. Understanding each other, sich verstehen, is always understanding each other with respect to something. From language, we learn that the subject matter, Sache, is not merely an arbitrary object of discussion, independent of the process of mutual understanding, sich verstehen, but rather is the path and goal of mutual understanding itself. And if two people understand each other independently of any topic, then this means that they understand each other not only in this or that respect, but in all the essential things that unite human beings. Understanding becomes a special task only when natural life, this joint meaning of the ment where both intend a common subject matter, is disturbed. Where misunderstandings have arisen, or where an expression of opinion alienates us because it is unintelligible, their natural life in the subject matter intended is impeded in such a way that the meaning is given as the opinion of another, the opinion of the thou or of the text, or in general as a fixed datum. And even then in general one attempts to reach a substantive agreement, not just sympathetic understanding of the other person, and this in such a way that again one proceeds via the subject matter. Only if all these movements comprising the art of conversation, argument, question and answer, objection and refutation, which are undertaken in regard to a text as an inner dialogue of the soul-seeking understanding, are in vain is the inquiry detoured. Only then does the effort of understanding become aware of the individuality of the thou and take account of their uniqueness. If we are dealing with a foreign language, the text will already be the object of a grammatical linguistic interpretation, but that is only a preliminary condition. The real problem of understanding obviously arises when, in the endeavor to understand the content of what is said, the reflective question arises: how did they come to such an opinion? For this kind of question reveals an alienness that is clearly of a quite different kind, and ultimately signifies a renunciation of shared meaning. Spinoza's critique of the Bible is a good example of this, and at the same time, one of the earliest. In Chapter 7 of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Spinoza elaborates his method of interpreting Scripture by analogy to the interpretation of nature. We have to derive the meaning, mens, of the authors from historical data, since things are related in these books, stories of miracles and revelations, that cannot be derived from the principles known to us by natural reason. Independently of the fact that Scripture on the whole undoubtedly has a moral significance, in these matters which are, in themselves, incomprehensible, imperceptibiles, everything important can be understood if only we understand the mind of the author historically, i.e., overcome our prejudices and think of nothing but what the author could have had in mind. Historical interpretation, in the spirit of the writer, is necessary then, because of the hieroglyphic and incomprehensible nature of the contents. In interpreting Euclid, says Spinoza, no one pays any heed to the life, studies, and habits, vita, studium et mores, of that. And this is true also for the spirit of the Bible in moral matters, circa documenta moralia. Only because there are incomprehensible things, res imperceptibiles, in the stories of the Bible, does our understanding of them depend on our being able to derive the author's meaning from the whole of their work, ut mentem auctoris percipiamus. And here, in fact, it does not matter whether what is meant corresponds to our insight, since we want to know only the meaning of the statements, sensus orationum, but not their truth, veritas. For this we need to exclude all prepossessions, even those of reason, and of course especially those generated by our prejudices. Thus, the naturalness of the understanding of Scripture depends on the fact that what makes sense can be understood at sight, and what does not can be understood historically. The breakdown of the immediate understanding of things in their truth is the motive for the detour into history. What this formulation of the interpretative principle means for Spinoza's own relationship to scriptural tradition is a separate question. In any case, for Spinoza, the extent of what can be understood only in this historical way is very great, even if the spirit of the whole, quod ipsa veram virtutem doceat, it teaches true virtue, is clear, and what is clear is of overwhelming significance. The circular argument in hermeneutics. It has always been known that this is a logically circular argument, insofar as the whole, in terms of which the part is to be understood, is not given before the part, unless in the manner of a dogmatic canon. This governs the Catholic and to some degree the Protestant understanding of Scripture, or some analogous preconception of the spirit of an age, such as when Ast presumes that retribution characterizes the spirit of the ancient world. Schleiermacher argues that these dogmatic guidelines cannot claim any prior validity and hence are only relative limitations of the circularity. Fundamentally, understanding is always a movement in this kind of circle, which is why the repeated return from the whole to the parts, and vice versa, is essential. Moreover, this circle is constantly expanding, since the concept of the whole is relative, and being integrated into ever larger contexts always affects the understanding of the individual part. Schleiermacher applies his usual procedure of a polar dialectical description to hermeneutics, and thus he takes account of the fact that understanding is provisional and unending, by elaborating it on the basis of the old hermeneutical principle of the whole and the parts. However, he intends this characteristic speculative relativization more as a schema describing the process of understanding than as a fundamental principle. This is shown by the fact that he assumes something like complete understanding when divinatory transposition takes place, when all the individual elements at last suddenly seem to receive full illumination. We might ask whether such phrases, which we also find in Boeck, with the same meaning, are to be taken strictly, or as describing only a relative completeness of understanding. It is true that Schleiermacher saw individuality as a secret that can never be fully unlocked, as Wilhelm von Humboldt even more definitely did. However, even this statement needs to be taken only in a relative way. The barrier to reason and understanding that remains here is not entirely insuperable. It is to be overcome by feeling, by an immediate, sympathetic, and congenial understanding. Hermeneutics is an art and not a mechanical process. Thus, it brings its work, understanding, to completion like a work of art. Now, the limitation of this hermeneutics based on the concept of individuality can be seen in the fact that Schleiermacher does not find the task of literary or scriptural exegesis, i.e., understanding a text written in a foreign language and coming from a past age, fundamentally more problematic than any other kind of understanding. It is true that even according to Schleiermacher, there is a special task when a temporal distance has to be bridged. Schleiermacher calls it identifying with the original reader. However, this process of identifying, the linguistic and historical production of sameness, is for him only an ideal precondition for the actual act of understanding, which for him does not consist in identifying with the original reader, but in putting oneself on the same level as the author, whereby the text is revealed as a unique manifestation of the author's life. Schleiermacher's problem is not historical obscurity, but the obscurity of the thou. We may wonder, however, whether it is possible to distinguish in this way between identifying with the original reader and the process of understanding. Actually, this ideal precondition of understanding, identifying with the original reader, cannot be fulfilled prior to the effort of understanding proper, but rather is inextricable from it. Even in the case of a contemporary text with whose language or content we are unfamiliar, the meaning is revealed only in the manner described, in the oscillating movement between whole and part. Schleiermacher recognizes this. It is always in this movement that we learn to understand an unfamiliar meaning, a foreign language, or a strange past. The circular movement is necessary because nothing that needs interpretation can be understood at once. For even within one's own language, it is still true that the reader must completely assimilate both the author's vocabulary and, even more, the uniqueness of what they say. From these statements, which are found in Schleiermacher himself, it follows that identifying with the original reader is not a preliminary operation that can be detached from the actual effort of understanding, which Schleiermacher sees as identifying with the writer. Let us examine more closely what Schleiermacher means by identification, for of course it cannot mean mere equation. Production and reproduction remain essentially distinct operations. Thus, Schleiermacher asserts that the aim is to understand a writer better than they understood themselves, a formula that has been repeated ever since. And in its changing interpretation, the whole history of modern hermeneutics can be read. Indeed, this statement contains the whole problem of hermeneutics. It would be valuable, therefore, to go further into its meaning. What it means for Schleiermacher is clear. He sees the act of understanding as the reconstruction of the production. This inevitably renders many things conscious of which the writer may be unconscious. It is obvious that here Schleiermacher is applying the aesthetics of genius to his universal hermeneutics. Creation by artistic genius is the model on which this theory of unconscious production and necessarily conscious reproduction is based. In fact, the formula understood in this way can be regarded as a principle of all philology, insofar as the latter is regarded as the understanding of artful discourse. The better understanding that distinguishes the interpreter from the writer does not refer to the understanding of the text's subject matter, but simply to the understanding of the text, i.e., of what the author meant and expressed. This understanding can be called better, insofar as the explicit thematized understanding of an opinion, as opposed to actualizing its contents, implies an increased knowledge. Thus the sentence says something almost self-evident. A person who learns to understand a text in a foreign language will make explicitly conscious the grammatical rules and literary forms which the author followed without noticing, because they lived in the language and in its means of artistic expression. The same is true of all production by artistic genius and its reception by others. We must remember this especially in regard to the interpretation of poetry. There, too, it is necessary to understand a poet better than they understood themselves, for they did not understand themselves at all, when the structure of their text took shape within them. From this also follows the point, which hermeneutics ought never to forget, that the artist who creates something is not the appointed interpreter of it. As an interpreter, they have no automatic authority over the person who is simply receiving their work. Insofar as they reflect on their own work, they are their own reader. The meaning that they, as a reader, give their own work does not set the standard. The only standard of interpretation is the sense of their creation, what it means. Thus, the idea of production by genius performs an important theoretical task, in that it collapses the distinction between interpreter and author. It legitimizes identification insofar as it is not the author's reflective self-interpretation, but the unconscious meaning of the author that is to be understood. This is what Schleiermacher means by his paradoxical formula. Since Schleiermacher, others, including August Buck, Steinthal, and Dilthey, have repeated his formula in the same sense. The philologist understands the speaker and poet better than they understand themselves and better than their contemporaries understood them, for they bring clearly into consciousness what was actually, but only unconsciously, present in the other. Through the knowledge of psychological laws, the philologist, according to Steinthal, can deepen their understanding by grasping the causality, the genesis of the work of literature, and the mechanics of the writer's mind. Steinthal's repetition of Schleiermacher's statement already betrays the effect of psychological research, which takes research into nature as its model. Dilthey is freer here, because he more firmly preserves the connection with the aesthetics of genius. In particular, he applies the formula to the interpretation of poetry. To understand the idea of a poem from its inner form can of course be called understanding it better. Dilthey regards this as the highest triumph of understanding, for the philosophical import of great poetry is revealed when it is understood as free creation. Free creation is not restricted by external conditions or by conditions of subject matter, and can therefore be grasped only as inner form. But we might ask whether this ideal case of free creation can really be taken as paradigmatic of the problem of hermeneutics. Indeed, whether even the understanding of works of art can be satisfactorily conceived by this criterion. We must also ask whether the statement that the aim is to understand an author better than they understood themselves still retains its original meaning when taken in conjunction with the presupposition of the aesthetics of genius, or whether it has not changed into something completely new. In fact, Schleiermacher's formula is not new with him. Bollnow, who has investigated the subject, quotes two places where this statement can be found before Schleiermacher, namely in Fichte and in Kant. He could not find any earlier instances. For this reason, Bollnow surmises that it was an oral tradition, a kind of philologist's rule of thumb that people passed on and Schleiermacher took up. For both external and internal reasons, this seems to me highly unlikely. This sophisticated methodological formula, which is still often used today as a license for arbitrary interpretations and is accordingly attacked, does not seem consistent with the philological mind. As humanists, they take pride in recognizing the absolute exemplariness of classical texts. For the true humanist, the classic author is certainly not such that the interpreter would claim to understand the work better than did the author themselves. We must not forget that the highest aim of the humanist was not originally to understand their models, but to imitate or even surpass them. Hence, they were originally obligated to their models, not only as an expositor, but also as an imitator, if not a rival. Like the dogmatic bond to the Bible, the humanists' bond to the classics had to give way to a looser relationship if the work of the interpreter was to reach the extreme self-conscious assurance expressed in the formula we are considering. Hence, it is likely that not until Schleiermacher, with whom hermeneutics became an independent method, detached from all content, could the interpreter claim superiority over their object. On closer examination, this accords with Kant and Fichte's use of the formula, for the context in which this alleged philologist's rule of thumb is employed shows that Fichte and Kant meant something quite different by it. With them, it is not a principle of philology, but a philosophical claim to move beyond the contradictions of a given theory by achieving greater conceptual clarity. Thus, it is a principle entirely in the spirit of rationalism. It claims solely through thought, through elaborating the implications of an author's ideas, to achieve insights into the real intention of the author, insights they would have shared if their thinking had been clear enough. Even the hermeneutically impossible thesis in which Fichte involves himself in the polemic against the dominant interpretation of Kant, that the inventor of a system is one thing, its expositors and followers another, as well as his claim to interpret Kant according to the spirit, are justified by the claim to critique the subject matter. Thus, the disputed formula makes no claim beyond that of philosophic critique of the subject matter. Someone who is better able to think their way through what an author is talking about will be able to see what the author says in the light of a truth hidden from the author. In this sense, the principle that one must understand an author better than they understand themselves is a very old one, as old as scientific critique, but it acquires its special pertinence to philosophical critique from the spirit of rationalism. As such, it has a sense completely different from Schleiermacher's philological rule. It is likely that Schleiermacher reinterpreted this principle of philosophical critique and made it a principle of philological interpretation. This would clearly indicate the position of Schleiermacher and the Romantics. In creating a universal hermeneutics, they expelled critique based on understanding the subject matter from the sphere of scholarly interpretation. Schleiermacher's formula, as he understands it, no longer pertains to the subject matter under discussion. Rather, he views the statement a text makes as a free production and disregards its content as knowledge. Accordingly, he organizes hermeneutics, which for him is concerned with understanding everything cast in language, according to the normative example of language itself. The discourse of the individual is in fact a free creative activity, however much its possibilities are limited by the fixed forms that language has taken. Language is an expressive field, and its primacy in the field of hermeneutics means, for Schleiermacher, that as an interpreter he regards the texts, independently of their claim to truth, as purely expressive phenomena. For him, even history is simply the display of this free creation, that of a divine productivity, and he regards the historian's posture as the observation and enjoyment of this mighty spectacle. The entry in Schleiermacher's diary that Dilthey quotes describes beautifully this romantic, reflective enjoyment of history. True historical significance rises above history. Phenomena exist like miracles, only to direct our attention towards the spirit that playfully generates them. When we read this, we can see how tremendous was the step that led from Schleiermacher's hermeneutics to a universal understanding of the historical sciences. However, universal the hermeneutics that Schleiermacher evolved, it was a universality with very perceptible limits. His hermeneutics, in fact, had in mind texts whose authority was undisputed. Undoubtedly, it is an important step in the development of historical consciousness that understanding and interpretation of both the Bible and the literature of classical antiquity was now completely detached from all dogmatic interest. Neither the saving truth of Scripture nor the exemplariness of the classics was to influence a procedure that was able to grasp every text as an expression of life and ignore the truth of what was said. However, the interest that motivated Schleiermacher's methodological abstraction was not that of the historian, but the theologian. He sought to teach how speech and a written tradition were to be understood because theology was concerned with one particular tradition, the biblical. For this reason, his hermeneutical theory was still a long way from a historiology that could serve as a methodological organon for the human sciences. Its goal was the exact understanding of particular texts, which was to be aided by the universality of historical contexts. This is Schleiermacher's limitation, and the historical worldview had to move beyond it. The connection between the historical school and romantic hermeneutics. The dilemma involved in the ideal of universal history. We must ask how historians understood their work in terms of their own hermeneutical theory. Their subject is not the individual text but universal history. It falls to the historian to understand the history of mankind as a whole. The individual text has no value in itself, but serves only as a source, i.e., only as material conveying knowledge of the historical context, just like the other silent relics of the past. Hence, the historical school could not really build on Schleiermacher's hermeneutics. But the historical worldview, which pursues the great goal of understanding universal history, had been based on the romantic theory of individuality and the corresponding hermeneutics. This can be put negatively by saying that what tradition represents for the present, namely the priority of history to life, had not yet been subjected to methodological reflection. Rather, historians saw their task as investigating tradition, and thus making the past available to the present. The basic scheme according to which the historical school conceives the methodology of universal history is therefore really the same methodology that applies to every text, the schema of whole and part. It certainly makes a difference whether one is trying to understand a text's intention and form as a literary structure, or whether one is trying to use it as a document in investigating a larger historical context, concerning which it gives information that is to be examined critically. Nevertheless, both literary and historical inquiry stress now the one and now the other approach. Historical interpretation, for example, can serve as a means to understand a given text, even when, from another perspective, it sees the text simply as a source which is part of the totality of the historical tradition. We find this expressed in clear methodological terms, neither in Ranke nor in the acute methodologist Droysen, but for the first time in Dilthey, who consciously takes up romantic hermeneutics and expands it into a historical method, indeed into an epistemology of the human sciences. Dilthey's logical analysis of the concept of context and coherence in history, in fact, consists in applying to history the hermeneutical principle that we can understand a detail only in terms of the whole text, and the whole only in terms of the detail. It is not just that sources are texts, but historical reality itself is a text that has to be understood. But in thus transposing hermeneutics to the study of history, Dilthey is only the interpreter of the historical school. He is formulating what Ranke and Droysen really think. So we see that romantic hermeneutics and its background, the pantheistic metaphysics of individuality, was a decisive influence on the theory of historical research in the 19th century. This was fatal for the human sciences and for the worldview of the historical school. We will see that Hegel's philosophy of world history, against which the historical school rebelled, recognized far more profoundly the importance of history for the being of spirit and the knowledge of truth than did the great historians, who would not admit that they were dependent on him. Schleiermacher's concept of individuality, which accorded so well with the concerns of theology, aesthetics, and literary criticism, was not only a means of critiquing the a prioristic construction of the philosophy of history, it also provided the historical sciences with a methodological orientation that directed them no less than the natural sciences toward research, i.e., to the only basis for progressive experience. Thus, resistance to the philosophy of world history drove history into the wake of philology. Its pride was to conceive the continuity of world history not teleologically, nor in the style of pre- or post-romantic enlightenment, in terms of a final state which would be the end of history, a day of judgment for world history, as it were. But for the historical school, there exists neither an end of history nor anything outside it. Hence, the whole continuity of universal history can be understood only from historical tradition itself. But this is precisely the claim of literary hermeneutics, namely that the meaning of a text can be understood from itself. Thus, the foundation for the study of history is hermeneutics. However, the ideal of universal history necessarily becomes a special problem for the historical worldview, since the book of history is a fragment that, so far as any particular present time is concerned, breaks off in the dark. The universal context of history lacks the self-containedness that a text has for the critic and that, for the historian, seems to make a biography, or the history of a nation that has exited from the stage of world history, or even the history of a period that is over, and now lies behind us, into a complete unit of meaning, a text intelligible within itself. Dilthey's romantic hermeneutics. We will see that Dilthey too thought in terms of these relative wholes, and hence built his work entirely upon the basis of romantic hermeneutics. What has to be understood in both cases is a totality of meaning which, also in both cases, has the same detachment from the person understanding it. It is always an alien individuality that must be judged according to its own concepts and criteria of value, but can nevertheless be understood because I and thou are of the same life. The hermeneutical basis can support us thus far, but neither this detachment of the object from its interpreter nor the self-containedness of content in a totality of meaning can possibly support the task specific to the historian universal history. For history is not only not at its end, but we its interpreters are situated within it, as a conditioned and finite link in a continuing chain. Given this problematical situation in regard to universal history, it would be reasonable to doubt that hermeneutics can really be the foundation for the study of history. Universal history is not a merely marginal and vestigial problem of historical investigation, but its very heart. Even the historical school knew that fundamentally there can be no other history than universal history, because the unique significance of the detail can be determined only from the whole. But since the whole can never be given to the empirical researcher, how can he maintain his ground against the philosopher and his a priori arbitrariness? Let us consider first how the historical school tries to deal with this problem of universal history. For this we have to start further afield, although within the theoretical context presented by the historical school we are pursuing only the problem of universal history, and hence are restricting ourselves to Ranke and Droysen. We remember how the historical school distinguished itself from Hegel. Its birth certificate, as it were, is its rejection of the a prioristic construction of world history. Its new claim is that not speculative philosophy but only historical research can lead to a universal view of history. It was Herder's critique of the Enlightenment schema of the philosophy of history that made this development possible. Herder's attack on the Enlightenment's pride in reason had its most effective weapon in the exemplary character of classical antiquity, which Winckelmann, in particular, had proclaimed. The history of ancient art was obviously more than a historical account. It was a critique of the present and a program. But because of the ambiguity of any critique of the present, the proclamation of the exemplary character of Greek art, which was supposed to erect a new ideal for one's own present, was still a genuine step towards historical knowledge. The past, which is here offered as a model for the present, proves to be something that is unique and unrepeatable, precisely because he is investigating the reasons for its peculiarity. Herder went only a little beyond Winckelmann when he saw that in everything past there is a dialectical relationship between what is exemplary and what is unrepeatable. He could then set a universal historical worldview against the Enlightenment's teleological view of history. To think historically now means to acknowledge that each period has its own right to exist, its own perfection. Herder took this step. The historical worldview could not reach full development as long as classicist prejudices accorded a special, paradigmatic place to classical antiquity. For not only a teleology in the style of the Enlightenment's belief in reason, but also a reverse teleology that situates perfection in a past era, or at the beginning of history, still posits a criterion that is beyond history. There are many ways of conceiving history in terms of a criterion that lies beyond it. Wilhelm von Humboldt's classicism views history as the decline and fall of the perfection of Greek life. The Gnostic theology of history of Goethe's time, whose influence on the young Ranke has been recently demonstrated, conceives the future as the re-establishment of a lost perfection of some primal time. Hegel reconciled the aesthetic exemplariness of classical antiquity with the self-conscious assurance of the present by describing the Greek religion of art as a form of the spirit that had been superseded, and by proclaiming the perfect fulfillment of history in the present in the universal self-consciousness of freedom. All these are ways of conceiving history that invoke a criterion that lies outside history. However, the denial of this kind of a priori, unhistorical criterion, which comes at the beginning of the historical inquiry of the 19th century, is not as free from metaphysical assumptions as it believes itself to be when it regards itself as scientific research. This can be seen by analyzing the leading concepts of the historical worldview. It is true that the purpose of these concepts is to avoid the preconceptions of an a priori historical construction. But although they are directed polemically against the idealistic concept of spirit, they remain related to it. This emerges very clearly in Dilthey's philosophical analysis of the historical worldview. Its starting point is entirely determined by its antithesis to philosophy of history. The basic assumption common to all these representatives of the historical worldview, Ranke, Droysen, and Dilthey, is that idea, essence, and freedom do not find any full or even sufficient expression in historical reality. This must not be regarded as a mere deficiency or shortcoming. Rather, they find the constitutive principle of history in the fact that the idea is only imperfectly represented in history. For this reason, philosophy must be replaced by historical research to inform man about himself and his place in this world. The idea of a history that would be the pure representation of the idea would mean renouncing history as an independent way to truth. But on the other hand, historical reality is not merely a heavy, opaque medium, mindless matter, rigid necessity against which the spirit beats in vain and in whose bonds it suffocates. This kind of Gnostic, Neoplatonic view of historical events as emergence into the external world of appearance does not do justice to the metaphysical value of history and hence to the status of historical science as knowledge. The unfolding of human life in time has its own productivity. The plenitude and variety of the human is increasingly realized in the unending vicissitudes of human destinies. This is a reasonable formulation of the basic assumption of the historical school. Its connection with the classicism of the age of Goethe is unmistakable. The guiding thought here is basically a humanist ideal. Wilhelm von Humboldt attributed the specific perfection of Greece to the rich variety of great individual forms that it manifests. Of course, the great historians were not to be limited to this kind of classicist ideal. Instead, they followed Herder. But now that it no longer acknowledges the preeminence of a classical age, what can the historical worldview that starts with Herder do, other than to view the whole of world history in terms of the same criterion that Wilhelm von Humboldt used to justify the preeminence of classical antiquity? A rich variety of individual phenomena is distinctive not only of Greek life, it is distinctive of historical life in general, and that is what constitutes the value and meaning of history. This is supposed to provide an answer to the anxious question about the meaning of the spectacle of brilliant victories and terrible defeats that troubles the human heart. The advantage of this answer is that the humanistic ideal implies no particular content, but is based on the formal idea of the greatest variety. This kind of ideal is truly universal, for it cannot be shaken by any historical experience, any disturbing evidence of the transience of human things. History has a meaning in itself. What seems to speak against it, the transience of all that is earthly, is in fact its real basis. In impermanence itself lies the mystery of an inexhaustible productivity of historical life. The question is only how to conceive the unity of world history in terms of the formal ideal of history, and how to justify the claim that we can have knowledge of world history. First, Ranke. Every act which is truly part of world history, which never consists solely of negation, but rather is able to engender in the fleeting present moment something for the future, includes within itself a full and immediate sense of its own indestructible value. Neither the preeminent position of classical antiquity, nor that of the present or future to which it leads, neither decline nor progress, those traditional basic categories of universal history, can be reconciled with genuine historical thought. On the other hand, the celebrated immediacy of the relationship between all periods and God can very easily be combined with this idea of the continuity, Zusammenhang, also coherence, of world history. For continuity, Herder calls it order in the succession of events, is the manifestation of historical reality itself. What is historically real emerges, according to strict laws of succession. Subsequent events place the nature and effect of what has just preceded in a bright public light. The first statement, then, concerning the formal structure of history, namely that it comes into being in its very passing away, is that, throughout the changing destinies of men, the continuity of life persists unbroken. From this, however, it is possible to see what Ranke considers an event that is truly part of world history and what the continuity of world history is really based on. It has no fixed goal that can be discovered outside itself. To this extent, there is no necessity, knowable a priori, at work in history, but the structure of historical continuity is still teleological, and its criterion is success. We saw that successive events indicate the importance of those preceding them. Ranke may have meant that this is a mere condition of historical knowledge. In fact, it is also the basis of the peculiar importance accorded to the meaning of history. Whether or not something is successful not only determines the meaning of a single event and accounts for the fact that it produces a lasting effect or passes unnoticed. Success or failure causes a whole series of actions and events to be meaningful or meaningless. The ontological structure of history itself, then, is teleological, although without a telos. This defines Ranke's concept of an event that is truly part of world history. it is such if it makes history, i.e., if it has an effect, Wirkung, that lends it a continuing historical significance. Hence, the elements of historical coherence, in fact, are determined by an unconscious teleology that connects them and excludes the insignificant from this coherence. Ranke's historical worldview. This kind of teleology cannot, of course, be demonstrated in terms of a philosophical concept. It does not make world history into an a priori system in which the actors are placed, as within a mechanism that is unconsciously directing them. It is, rather, compatible with freedom of action. Ranke is able to say that the links that create historical continuity are scenes of freedom. This expression means that in the infinite web of events there are particularly significant incidents in which historical decisions are, as it were, concentrated. Decisions are made wherever actions are performed in freedom, but that this decision really decides something, i.e., that a decision makes history and through its effect reveals its full and lasting significance, is the mark of truly historic moments. They articulate the historical whole. We call such moments, in which a freely chosen action has a decisive effect on history, epoch-making moments or crises, and the individuals whose actions have this effect can be called, to use Hegel's phrase, historic individuals. Ranke calls them original minds, which intervene independently in the battle of ideas and world forces, and gather together the most powerful ones, those on which the future depends. This is absolutely Hegelian thinking. We have a highly informative reflection of Ranke's on how the historical whole follows from such free decisions. Let us admit that history can never have the unity of a philosophical system, but it is not without inner coherence. Before us we see a range of successive events that condition one another. When I say condition, I do not mean with absolute necessity. Rather, the important thing is that human freedom is involved everywhere. The writing of history follows the scenes of freedom. This is its greatest attraction. But freedom involves power, germinal power. Without the latter, the former disappears, both in world events and in the sphere of ideas. At every moment something new can begin, something whose sole origin is the primary and common source of all human activity. Nothing exists entirely for the sake of something else. Nothing is entirely identical with the reality of something else. But still a deep inner coherence penetrates everywhere, and no one is entirely independent of it. Beside freedom stands necessity. It consists in what has already been formed and cannot be destroyed, which is the basis of all new activity. What has already come into being coheres with what is coming into being. But even this continuity itself is not something arbitrary to be merely accepted, but it has come into existence in one particular way and not another. It is likewise an object of knowledge. A long series of events, succeeding and simultaneous to one another, linked together in this way, constitute a century, an epoch. The significant thing about this account is the way the concept of freedom is linked to the concept of power. Power is obviously the central category of the historical worldview. Herder had already used it to escape from the Enlightenment schema of progress and especially from the concept of reason that underlay it. The concept of power has such a central place within the historical worldview because in it, interiority and exteriority are held in a peculiarly tense unity. All power exists only in its expression. Expression is not only the manifestation of power, but its reality. Hegel was quite right when he explicated the intrinsic relationship between power and expression dialectically. But this dialectic also shows that power is more than its expression. It possesses potentiality also, i.e., it is not only the cause of a particular effect, but the capacity wherever it is used to have that effect. Thus, its mode of being is different from that of an effect. It has the mode of suspension, anstellen, a word that suggests itself because it expresses precisely the independent existence of power, as against the indefiniteness of whatever it may express itself in. It follows that power cannot be known or measured in terms of its expressions, but only experienced as an indwelling. The observation of an effect always shows only the cause and not the power. if the power is an inner surplus over and above the cause of a given effect. This surplus, of which we are aware in the cause, can certainly be understood also in terms of the effect. In the resistance it offers, in that offering resistance is itself an expression of power. But even then it is through an awareness that power is experienced. Interiority is the mode of experiencing power because power, of its nature, is related to itself alone. In his Phenomenology of Mind, Hegel has convincingly demonstrated how the concept of power is dialectically superseded in the infinity of life, which is related to itself alone and dwells in itself. Thus, Ranke's formulation takes on a world historical character, one within the world history of thought and philosophy. Plato was the first to remark the reflexive structure of dunamis in this connection, and this made it possible to apply it to the nature of the soul. This Aristotle did in his doctrine of the dunameus, the powers of the soul. Ontologically, power is inwardness. Thus, it is quite correct for Ranke to write, freedom is combined with power. For power that is more than its expression is always freedom. This is of decisive importance for the historian. He knows that everything could have been different, and every acting individual could have acted differently. The power that makes history is not mechanical power. Ranke excludes this specifically by calling it germinal power, and speaking of the primary and common source of all human activity. For Ranke, this is freedom. It is not a contradiction for freedom to be limited. We can see this from the nature of power when it expresses itself. That is why Ranke can say, beside freedom stands necessity. For necessity does not mean here a cause that excludes freedom, but the resistance that free power encounters. Here the truth of the dialectic of power that Hegel revealed is made manifest. The resistance that free power encounters is itself freedom. The necessity we are concerned with here is the power of what has been transmitted and of those who are acting against one, which is prior to any operation of free activity. By excluding many things as impossible, it limits action to the possible. Necessity itself comes from freedom and is itself qualified by the freedom that reckons with it. In terms of logic, it is a question of hypothetical necessity, the ex hypotheseos anankaion. In terms of content, we are concerned not with nature but with historical being. What has come into being cannot simply be destroyed. Hence it is the basis of all new activity, as Ranke says, and yet it is something that has come about through actions. In that what has come into existence persists as a foundation for the new, it sets the new action within a unified context. Ranke says, what has already come into being coheres with what is coming into being. This very obscure sentence is clearly trying to express the nature of historical reality, that what comes into being is free, but the freedom from which it comes is always limited by what has come into being, i.e., by the situation into which it comes. The concepts that historians use, such as power, force, determining tendency, all seek to reveal the essence of historical being, in that they imply that the idea never attains full representation in history. It is not the plans and views of those who act that constitute the meaning of the event, but historical effects that reveal the historical powers. The historical powers, not the monadic subjectivity of the individual, are the real basis of historical development. In fact, all individuation is itself already partly characterized by the reality that stands over against it, and that is why individuality is not subjectivity, but living power. Even states are such living powers for Ranke. He explicitly said of them that they are not divisions of the universal, but individualities. Real spiritual Ranke calls them thoughts of God, in order to indicate that what brings them into being is their own living power, and not some human creation or desire, or some plan that people project. The use of the category of power now makes it possible to think of the coherence of history as a primary given. Power is real always only as an interplay of powers, and history is this interplay of powers that produces a continuity. Both Ranke and Droysen say in this regard that history is a growing sum. Thus, they reject all claim to an a priori construction of world history, and they consider this view to be based wholly on experience. The question is, however, whether more is not assumed here than they know. That universal history is a growing sum means that it is a whole, though an unfinished one. But this is by no means obvious. Items that are qualitatively different cannot be added up. Adding up, rather, presupposes that the unity in terms of which they are grouped is already the criterion of that grouping. But this presupposition is an assertion. The idea of unity in history is, in fact, not so formal and independent from understanding the contents of history as it appears to beg. The world of history has not always been conceived in terms of the unity of world history. As with Herodotus, for example, it can also be considered a moral phenomenon. As such, it offers a large number of exempla but no unity. What justifies talk of the unity of world history? This question used to be answered easily when it was assumed that there was a unity of goal, and hence of a plan, in history. But what is the common denominator that allows historical events to be grouped together if this kind of goal and plan in history is not accepted? If the reality of history is conceived as an interplay of forces, this concept is obviously not enough to make its unity necessary. What guided Herder and Humboldt, the ideal of the rich variety of the manifestations of human life, does not as such ground any true unity. In the continuity of events, there must be the something that emerges as a goal, giving an orientation to the whole. In fact, the place that is occupied in the eschatologies of the philosophy of history, both of religious origin and in their secularized versions, is here empty. No preconceived idea concerning the significance of history should prejudice historical research. However, the self-evident assumption of historical research is that history constitutes a unity. Thus, Droysen can explicitly acknowledge that the unity of world history is a regulative idea, even if it is not a concept of a providential plan. However, in this postulate lies a further assumption that determines its content. The idea of the unity of world history implies the uninterrupted continuity of the development of world history. This idea of coherence or continuity is primarily formal in nature and does not imply any actual contents. It too is like an a priori of research that invites one to penetrate ever more deeply into the complexities of historical continuity. To this extent, it is only methodological naivete on Ranke's part when he speaks of the amazing steadiness of historical development. What he actually means by this is not the structure of this steadiness itself, but the contents that emerge in the steady development. That something unique finally emerges from the vast and multifarious whole of historical development, namely, the unity of Western civilization which, produced by the Germanic and Romance peoples, spreads over the whole earth, is what arouses his admiration. Admittedly, even if we acknowledge the significance of Ranke's admiration of steadiness in terms of content, his naivete is still there. That world history has produced Western culture in a continuous development is again not a mere fact of experience that historical consciousness acknowledges, but a condition of historical consciousness itself, i.e., something that need not have happened or could be canceled out by new experience. Only because history has taken this course can the question of its meaning be raised by a world historical consciousness, and the unity of its continuity be meant. For this we can cite Ranke himself. As he sees it, the main difference between the Eastern and the Western system is that in the West, historical continuity constitutes the form of cultural existence. Nor is it by chance that the unity of history depends on the unity of Western civilization, to which belong Western science in general and history as science in particular. And it is also not by chance that Western civilization is characterized by Christianity, which has its absolute temporal moment in the unique redemptive event. Ranke recognized something of this when he viewed the Christian religion as the restoration of man to immediacy to God, which, in romantic fashion, he set at the primeval beginning of all. But we will see below that the fundamental significance of this situation has not been fully acknowledged in the philosophical reflection of the proponents of the historical worldview. Thus, the empirical orientation of the historical sciences is not without philosophical assumptions. It was the acute methodologist Droysen who freed history from its empirical disguise and recognized its fundamental significance. His basic viewpoint is that continuity is the essence of history, because history, unlike nature, includes the element of time. Droysen constantly quotes Aristotle's statement about the soul, that it increases within itself, epidosis eis hauto. Unlike the mere repetitiveness of nature, history is characterized by this increase within itself. But this involves preservation and at the same time surpassing what is preserved. Self-knowledge embraces both. Thus, history is not only an object of knowledge, self-knowledge determines its being. Knowledge of it is itself. The amazing steadiness of historical development of which Ranke spoke is based on the consciousness of continuity, a consciousness that makes history history. It would be quite wrong to regard this as only an idealist prejudice. Rather, this a priori of historical thought is itself a historical reality. Jakob Burckhardt is quite right to view the continuity of Western cultural tradition as the very condition of the existence of Western culture. The collapse of this tradition, the rise of a new barbarism, which Burckhardt prophesied, would not, for the historical worldview, be a catastrophe within history but the end of world history itself, at least insofar as it tries to understand itself as a world historical unity. It is important to recognize this presupposition in the historical school's inquiry into universal history precisely because its existence is fundamentally denied. Thus, as we saw in Ranke and Droysen, the historical school's hermeneutical self-understanding has its ultimate foundation in the idea of universal history. The historical school, however, could not accept Hegel's explanation of the unity of world history through the concept of spirit. That spirit reaches its culmination in the perfect self-consciousness of the historical present, which constitutes the significance of history, is an eschatological self-interpretation, which basically supersedes history by turning it into a speculative concept. The historical school was, instead, forced into a theological understanding of itself. If it was not to undermine its own disposition to think of itself as progressive research, it had to relate its own finite and limited knowledge to a divine spirit, to which things are known in their perfection. It is the old ideal of infinite understanding applied to the knowledge of history. Ranke writes, "Imagine the deity, if I may allow myself this observation, as seeing the whole of historical humanity in its totality, since no time lies before the deity, and finding it all equally. Here the idea of an infinite understanding, intellectus infinitus, for which everything exists simultaneously, omnia simul, is transformed into the original image of historical impartiality. The historian who knows that all epochs and all historical phenomena are equally justified before God approximates that image. Thus, the historian's consciousness represents the perfect culmination of human self-consciousness. The more he is able to recognize the unique, indestructible value of every phenomenon, that is, to think historically, the more his thought is godlike. That is why Ranke compares the office of historian to that of priest. Immediacy to God is for the Lutheran Ranke the real content of the Christian gospel. The re-establishment of the immediacy that existed before the fall does not take place through the Church's means of grace alone. The historian has a share in it too, in that he makes mankind, which has fallen into history, the object of his study, and knows mankind in the immediacy to God, which it has never entirely lost. Universal history, world history are not, in fact, epitomes of a formal kind, referring to the totality of events. Rather, in historical thinking, the universe, as the divine creation, is raised to a consciousness of itself. True, this is not a conceptual consciousness. The ultimate result of the study of history is sympathy, co-knowledge of the universe. It is against this pantheistic background that Ranke's famous remark that he would like to extinguish himself is to be understood. Of course, as Dilthey objected, This self-extinction is in fact the expansion of the self to make a universe within. But it is not by chance that Ranke does not take this further mental step, a step that leads Dilthey to ground the human sciences in psychology. For Ranke, self-extinction is still a form of real sharing. We must not understand this concept of sharing in a psychological and subjective way, but in terms of the underlying concept of life. Because all historical phenomena are manifestations of universal life, to share in them is to share in life. This gives the word understanding its almost religious tone. To understand is to participate immediately in life, without any mediation through concepts. Just this is what the historian is concerned with, not relating reality to ideas, but everywhere reaching the point where life thinks and thought lives. In being understood, the phenomena of historical life are seen as manifestations of universal life, of the divinity. Understanding and penetration mean indeed more than a human cognitive achievement, and more than merely the creation of an inner universe, as Dilthey, contradicting Ranke, reformulated the ideal of the historian. It is a metaphysical statement, which brings Ranke very close to Fichte and Hegel when he says, "The clear, full, lived insight is the very pith of being made visible and transparent to itself." It is quite obvious from such a remark that fundamentally Ranke remained close to German idealism. The full self-transparency of being, which Hegel saw as realized in the absolute knowledge of philosophy, is the basis of Ranke's consciousness of himself as a historian, however much he rejects speculative philosophy. That is why the image of the poet is so close to him, and he feels no need to distinguish himself as an historian from the poet. For what the historian has in common with the poet is that, like the poet, he depicts the element in which everyone lives as something that lies outside him. The complete surrender to the contemplation of things, the epic attitude of a man who is trying to tell the tale of world history, may in fact be called poetic, since for the historian God is present in all things, not as a concept, but as an outward idea. We cannot describe Ranke's view of himself better than by these terms of Hegel. The historian, as Ranke sees him, belongs to that form of absolute spirit Hegel called religion of art. The relation between historical study and hermeneutics in J.G. Droysen. A historian whose thinking was more acute inevitably realized the problems of this self-conception. The philosophical significance of Droysen's Historic is that he tries to free the concept of understanding from the indefiniteness of the aesthetic pantheistic communion that it has in Ranke, and formulate its conceptual presuppositions. The first of these is expression. Understanding is the understanding of expression. In expression, something interior is immediately present. But this inward thing, the inner essence, is the first and true reality. Here, Droysen is entirely Cartesian, and he stands in the tradition of Kant and Wilhelm von Humboldt. The individual ego is like a lonely point in the world of appearances, but in its utterances, above all in language and in all the forms in which it expresses itself, it is no longer a lonely point. It belongs to the world of the intelligible. Understanding history is not, however, fundamentally different from understanding language. Like language, the world of history does not possess the character of a purely spiritual being. To want to understand the ethical and the historical world means above all that one recognizes that it is neither merely docetic nor merely. He asserts this against the empiricism of Buckle, but it is also valid against the spiritualism of, say, Hegel's philosophy of history. Droysen sees the dual nature of history as founded in the curious charism of human nature, which is so happily imperfect that both mentally and physically it has to behave ethically. With these ideas borrowed from Wilhelm von Humboldt, Droysen is not trying to say anything other than what Ranke meant when he emphasized power. He, too, regards the reality of history as something other than pure spirit. To behave ethically implies, rather, seeing that the world of history is not merely the impress of the will on wholly malleable material. Its reality consists in the mind's constantly renewed effort to grasp and form the ever-changing finite systems to which every person belongs. From this dual nature of history, Droysen can now draw conclusions about the historical approach. Modeling it on the way poets work, as Ranke did, is no longer sufficient for him. Self-extinction in contemplation or narration does not lead us to historical reality, for the poets compose a psychological interpretation of the events they describe. But in real life, there are elements at work quite other than personalities. The poets treat historical reality as if it were intended and planned by the persons engaged in it. But the reality of history does not consist in being meant in this way. Hence, the real desires and plans of the actors are not the specific object of historical understanding. Psychological interpretation of particular individuals cannot exhaust the significance of historical events. Neither is the person's will fully realized in this particular situation, nor is what has come about simply the result of his strength of will and intelligence. It is neither the pure nor the whole expression of his personality. Hence, psychological interpretation is only a subordinate element in historical understanding, and that not only because it does not really attain its goal. It is not just that it meets impediments. The interiority of the person, the sanctum of conscience, is not only unattainable by the historian, but what can be reached only by sympathy and love is not the goal and object of his research. He does not have to penetrate the mysteries of individual people. What he investigates is not individuals as such, but what they mean as elements in the movement of moral powers. The concept of moral powers occupies a central place in Droysen. It is the basis of both history's mode of being and the possibility of knowing it. Ranke's vague reflections on freedom, power, and necessity now acquire their substantive content. Similarly, Ranke's use of the concept of historical fact is corrected by Droysen. The individual, in the contingency of his particular drives and purposes, is not an element in history, but only insofar as he raises himself to the sphere of moral commonality and participates in it. The movement of these moral powers, which is achieved through the common work of humankind, constitutes the course of things. It is perfectly true that what is possible is thereby limited, but to speak of a conflict between freedom and necessity would be to reflect oneself out of one's own historical finiteness. The actor is inextricably situated under the postulate of freedom. The course of things is not an extrinsic barrier to freedom, for it depends not on rigid necessity, but on the movement of the moral powers, to which one is always related. It sets the task in performing which the moral energy of the actor proves itself. Hence, Droysen establishes a far more adequate relationship between freedom and necessity in history when he sees it entirely in terms of the historical actor. He relates necessity to the unconditional moral imperative and freedom to the unconditional will. Both are expressions of the moral power by which the individual belongs to the moral sphere. For Droysen, too, it is the concept of power that reveals the limits of all speculative metaphysics of history. Accordingly, like Ranke, he criticizes Hegel's concept of development, in that there is no germ that simply grows in the course of history. But he defines more sharply what power means here. Powers grow with work. The moral power of the individual becomes a historical power insofar as it is at work on the great common goals. It becomes a historical power in that the moral sphere is what is lasting and powerful in the movement of history. Hence, power is no longer an original and direct manifestation of universal life, as with Ranke, but exists only in this mediation, and only through mediation does it achieve historical reality. The mediate moral world moves in such a way that everyone participates in it, but in different ways. Some preserve existing conditions by continuing to do the customary thing, while others have new ideas and express them. The continuity of the historical process consists in this constant overcoming of what is, through criticism based on what ought to be. Thus, Droysen would not speak of mere scenes of freedom, for freedom is the fundamental pulse of historical life, and does not exist only in exceptional cases. The great personalities of history are only one element in the forward progress of the moral world, which is as a whole and in every detail a world of freedom. He agrees with Ranke, against historical a priorism, that we cannot see the end but only the direction of the movement, the final goal of all our aims, toward which the restless activity of mankind is drawn, cannot be discerned through historical knowledge. It is only something we sense dimly, something we believe. The place he assigns historical knowledge accords with this image of history. It, too, cannot be understood as Ranke understood it, as aesthetic self-forgetfulness and self-extinction in the manner of great epic poets. The pantheistic element in Ranke was responsible for the claim to a universal and yet immediate participation in, a co-knowledge of, the universe. Droysen, on the other hand, thinks of the intermediaries in which understanding moves. The moral powers are the actual reality of history, and to them not only the individual rises in his acts. The historian also rises to them, transcending his own particularity. The historian is defined and limited by belonging to particular moral spheres, his native land, and his political and religious persuasions. But his participation depends precisely on this insuperable one-sidedness. Within the concrete conditions of his own historical existence, not from some position suspended above things, he sets himself the task of being fair. This is his fairness, namely that he tries to understand. Understanding through research. Hence Droysen's formula for historical knowledge is understanding through research. This process implies both an infinite mediation and an ultimate immediacy. The concept of research, which Droysen links significantly with understanding, is intended to designate the infinite nature of the task. This task distinguishes the historian from the completeness of an artistic creation just as fundamentally as from the complete harmony produced by the sympathy and love between I and thou. Only in ceaseless research into tradition, in opening up new sources, and in ever new interpretations of them, does research move progressively toward the idea. This sounds as if it were based on the procedure of the natural sciences, and were in anticipation of the neo-Kantian interpretation of the thing in itself as the infinite task. But on closer examination, we see that something more is also involved. Droysen's formulation distinguishes the activity of the historian not only from the ideal completeness of art and the intimate communion of souls, but also, it seems, from the procedure of the natural sciences. At the end of the lecture, we find the words that we, unlike the natural sciences, cannot make use of experiment, that we only do research and can do nothing but research. Thus, there must be another element in the concept of research that is important for Droysen, and not just the fact that the task of historical research is infinite, like the infinite progress of research into nature. This element, in contrast to the science of the 18th century and the doctrina of earlier centuries, contributed to the rise of the concept of research in the 19th century. Starting probably from the image of a studious traveler penetrating into unknown regions, this conception of research embraces the knowledge of both nature and the historical world. The more the theological and philosophical background of the knowledge of the world fades away, the more science is conceived as an advance into unknown regions and hence is called research. But this is not enough to explain how Droysen distinguishes historical method from the experimental method of the natural sciences when he says that historical work is research, nothing but research. There must be another infinity different from that of the unknown world, which in Droysen's eyes distinguishes historical knowledge from research. His thought seems as follows. Research possesses a different, as it were, qualitative infiniteness, if what is studied can never itself come into view. This is, in fact, the case with the historical past, in contrast to the self-givenness of experiment in the study of nature. In order to know, historical research investigates something that is always different, namely tradition, which is always new. Unlike the experiment, its answer never has the clear unambiguity of what has been seen with one's own eyes. If we now ask what is the origin of this element in the concept of research, which Droysen follows in the surprising antithesis of experiment and research, then we are brought, it seems to me, to the concept of the study of conscience. The world of history depends on freedom, and this on the mystery of the person that is ultimately unfathomable by research. Only the self-research of one's own conscience can approach it, and only God can know the truth here. For this reason, historical research does not seek knowledge of laws and cannot appeal to the decisiveness of experiment. For the historian is separated from his object by the infinite mediation of tradition. But on the other hand, this distance is also proximity. The historian does not investigate his object by establishing it unequivocally in an experiment. Rather, through the intelligibility and familiarity of the moral world, he is integrated with his object in a way completely different from the way a natural scientist is bound to his. Hearsay is here not bad evidence, but the only evidence possible. Every ego enclosed within itself, each one revealing itself to every other one in its utterances. What is known is, accordingly, totally different in both cases. What laws are to the study of nature, moral powers are to the historian. In them, he finds his truth. Through ceaseless research into tradition, understanding is, in the end, always possible. Despite all mediation, for Droysen, the concept of understanding is still characterized by an ultimate immediacy. The possibility of understanding consists in the fact that the utterances presented to us as historical material are congenial to us. With respect to men, human utterances and forms, we are and feel ourselves to be essentially similar and in a condition of mutuality. Just as understanding connects the individual ego with the moral commonalities to which it belongs, so also these moral commonalities themselves, family, people, state, and religion, can be understood as expressions. Thus, by means of the concept of expression, historical reality rises into the sphere of meaning, and hence in Droysen's deliberations on method 2, hermeneutics becomes the master key to the study of history. The detail is understood within the whole, and the whole from the detail. This is the old rhetorico-hermeneutic rule, now turned inward. The man understanding, because he is an ego, a totality in himself, like those whom he is trying to understand, completes this totality with the individual utterance, and the individual utterance with this totality. This is Schleiermacher's formula. In applying it, Droysen shares its premise, namely that history, which he sees as acts of freedom, is nevertheless as profoundly intelligible and meaningful as a text. Understanding history like understanding a text culminates in spiritual presence. Thus, we see that Droysen determines more exactly than Ranke what mediate elements are involved in research and understanding, but ultimately even he can conceive the task of historical research only in aesthetic hermeneutic categories. For Droysen, too, the aim of historical research is to reconstruct the great text of history from the fragments of tradition.